In every corner of history, there are stories the world tried to forget. Tales of courage, cruelty, and the quiet moments before the end. They are not just about how people died, but about how they lived and what their final moments revealed about the world they left behind. These are not stories of horror, but of humanity. This is History Radio, where we walk through the shadows of time to listen to the echoes of those who came before us. Each voice, each tragedy, is a reminder that behind every empire and every revolution, there was a heartbeat that stopped too soon. We will travel through centuries, across kingdoms, battlefields, and quiet rooms, where fate whispered and history wrote its final lines. From the samurai who faced the fire with his child in his arms, to the queen who bowed her head before the blade, to the dreamers who reached too far into the stars. Their ends were tragic, but their stories endure. So let the noise of the world fade. Let the light grow dim. And listen, because in these stories, death is not an ending. It is a mirror reflecting everything we are and everything we will one day become. Long ago, in the shadowed streets of Kyoto, there lived a man who refused to bow. His name was Ishikawa Goemon. To some, he was a criminal. To others, a hero. In a Japan torn by warlords and corruption, he became the whisper of rebellion, the man who stole from the rich to feed the hungry. His story would end in fire and boiling water. But before that day, he lived as a legend, walking the fine line between myth and man. Goemon was said to have once been a samurai. Others claimed he was a ninja. The truth, like much of history, lies somewhere in the fog. What is known is that he lived during the rule of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, one of Japan's great unifiers, a man who brought peace to the land through endless war. Goemon despised him. Some say Toyotomi's army had taken everything from him: his wife, his peace. Others say he simply hated tyranny. Either way, his heart turned toward revenge. On a warm summer night in 1594, under the quiet hum of cicadas, Goemon crept through the halls of Fushimi Castle, a blade hidden beneath his robe. His target slept just beyond the paper walls. But fate, cruel as ever, demanded payment. A bell rang, a single sound that shattered the silence. Guards swarmed the corridor. The assassin was captured before he could strike. The man who once walked as a shadow was dragged into the light. For crimes against the ruler, Goemon was sentenced not to the sword, but to something far worse: death by boiling. It was a punishment so rare, even in a world where death came easy. The sentence was public. To make the pain deeper, his young son was condemned to share his fate. When the day came, the streets of Kyoto filled with people. A massive iron cauldron stood before the Nunzenji temple. Inside, clear water waited like the calm before a storm. Goemon stood tall, his child beside him. As flames were lit beneath the pot, he lifted his boy high above his head, shielding him from the rising heat. Steam began to curl. The crowd grew silent. As the water boiled, Goemon's skin blistered. His breath turned to screams swallowed by smoke. Still, he held his son higher, his arms trembling. Some say the crowd, unable to bear the sight, rushed forward to save the boy. They say Goemon smiled in his final moment, seeing his son taken to safety. But others tell a darker story. They say no one came. That as Goemon looked out at the sea of faces, he realized help would never arrive. His strength fading, he made an unthinkable choice. He lowered his child into the boiling water, ending his pain in an instant. Then, with his last breath, he lifted the small body again above his head. One final act of defiance. One last message to the warlord who had taken everything. He stared into the crowd until the heat consumed him. When it was over, the pot was still. The crowd dispersed. History did what it always does. It turned the horror into a story. Gomon became a symbol, a spirit of rebellion that refused to die. Centuries later, his name appears in theater, film, and even video games. He became Japan's Robin Hood, the man who laughed at power even as it destroyed him. But behind the legend is a truth far more human. A father who tried to save his child. A rebel who faced the impossible. A man who discovered that even in boiling water, dignity cannot melt. Perhaps that is why his story endures. Because some deaths are so cruel, they burn themselves into memory, refusing to cool with time. So when you hear the quiet hum of summer, remember the man who faced the fire and did not bow. Ishikawa Gomon, the boiled samurai, whose final act was not of rage, but of love. In the winter of 1492, Barcelona was dressed in celebration. The war was over. The king and queen were victorious, and the people hoped peace had finally returned. Among them walked a peasant named Juan de Cañamares, a man of little wealth and even less power, but with something far more dangerous in his hard anger. He had seen too much suffering, too much hunger, too many broken promises from the nobles who ruled his land. The crown had demanded obedience, and he had nothing left to give. Cañamares was no warrior, no trained assassin. He was a simple Catalan farmer who had fought in the long peasant revolts, known as the Wars of the Remnants. For years, men like him had worked the soil, not for their families, but for lords who owned both the land and their lives. When the war ended, the peasants thought freedom had been won. But instead, the king demanded gold to buy their liberty of freedom with a price few could pay. To Juan, it was betrayal dressed as mercy. So on a cold December morning, as King Ferdinand II of Aragon walked through a crowded square in Barcelona, Juan moved toward him. He hid a short blade beneath his cloak. When the king turned to greet his people, Juan struck. A single flash of steel sliced across the king's face, from ear to back. The crowd froze. Then chaos erupted. Guards swarmed, and within seconds, the peasant was dragged to the ground, bleeding, beaten, but alive. The king survived, and he demanded that Juan be kept breathing, not out of mercy, but for spectacle. The queen believed the attack was part of a larger conspiracy. To prove his guilt, the man would be questioned, tortured, and displayed before all who had once dared to rebel. The interrogation was brutal, and Juan confessed to hearing the devil's voice, whispering that if he killed the king, he would become the new ruler. Madness, perhaps. Or maybe a final attempt to shield others from blame. What came next would be remembered as one of the most horrific executions in European history. On a gray afternoon, the city gathered to watch. A wooden cart rolled slowly through the streets, carrying Juan tied upright to a post. His skin was bare against the winter air. At each stop along the route, the executioners stepped forward. The punishment was called the Parade of Mutilation. It was not designed to kill quickly. It was designed to teach. At the first stop, they cut off the hand that had held the blade. At the next, they burned his flesh with iron tongs heated red. Then came the eyes, the chest, the nose, and finally the feet. Piece by piece, they took him apart while the crowd watched in stunned silence. Some accounts say he died halfway through the road, his body unable to endure the agony. Others say they carried his lifeless remains to the final square anyway, just to finish the ritual. There, his body was stoned, burned, and turned to ash. The king recovered. The rebellion faded into the pages of history. But the story of Juan de Cañamares lived on, passed in whispers through generations of peasants who remembered not the madness, but the courage. The courage of a man so desperate for freedom that he dared to raise his hand against a king. History painted him as insane. Perhaps he was. Or perhaps he was simply a man who could no longer accept a world where the poor were born in chains. His act changed nothing that day, but his suffering became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world he lived in. When we look back, we like to believe we have evolved beyond such cruelty. Yet every age finds its own way to parade pain for the sake of power. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of history, the wheels of that cart still creak along the cobblestone. The story of Juan de Cañamares reminds us that rebellion, even in its madness, is born from a single truth: the human heart can only endure so much before it breaks. And when it does, it demands to be heard, even if its voice is the last sound it ever makes. Power is a fragile thing. It shines brightly, blinds those who hold it, and then burns them from within. Few men learned that truth more painfully than Valerian, Emperor of Europe. For 7 short years, he ruled one of the greatest empires on earth. And in the end, he became its greatest humiliation. Valerian was a soldier first, emperor second. He rose through the ranks at a time when Rome was cracking under pressure. The empire was divided, its borders constantly under attack, its people weary of war. Beyond those borders lay Persia, ruled by King Shapur I, a man as ambitious as he was ruthless. When Shapur's armies invaded Roman territory, Valerian decided to lead his troops personally, believing that the sight of an emperor in armor would inspire victory. It was a decision that would cost him everything. In the year 260, the two empires met near the city of Edessa. The sun burned hot, the dust thick as ash. Valerian's army, weakened by plague and poor supplies, faced a Persian force that outnumbered them 2-1. Still, the emperor stood on the front line. When the battle began, it was chaos. Roman discipline shattered. Men fled, horses screamed, and in the end, Valerian himself was captured. The ruler of Rome, once a god among men, was now a prisoner in chains. For King Shapur, it was a moment of triumph. No Roman emperor had ever been taken alive before. He paraded Valerian through his cities as proof that Persia had broken the unbreakable. The once proud emperor was forced to kneel before his captor, to serve as a living symbol of Roman defeat. And yet, Shapur's cruelty did not end there. Every time the Persian king mounted his horse, he used Valerian's back as a stepping stool. Imagine the emperor of the world, bent to the dust, his body nothing more than a platform for another man's glory. Over the years, Valerian's captivity became legend. Some said he was kept alive for years, humiliated before courtiers and foreign guests. Others claimed he was tortured and displayed like a prize animal. But it was his final moment that burned itself into history. One story tells that Valerian offered his captor gold in exchange for freedom, a mountain of it. Shapur laughed. He ordered molten gold to be poured down the emperor's throat. It was a cruel joke, a punishment wrapped in irony. The man who ruled the richest empire on earth would die by the very thing that symbolized his wealth. Another version says Shapur had him flayed alive, his skin stuffed and displayed as a warning to any Roman who dared invade Persia again. Whether burned from within or stripped to the bone, Valerian's death became a lesson in pride. His body was destroyed, but his shame lived on, haunting the empire long after his bones had turned to dust. Back in Rome, emperors who followed tried to erase his name. They called him unlucky, unworthy, cursed by the gods. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Valerian was not undone by fate or treachery, but by arrogance. He believed himself untouchable, chosen, eternal, and yet, when he stood before another man who believed the same, he discovered the truth that humbles every ruler in the end, that power is borrowed, never owned. Centuries later, historians still argue about how he died. But the image remains. An emperor brought low. His golden crown melted into poison. Somewhere in the ruins of time, the ghosts of Rome still whisper his name, not with pride, but with pity. Because in the long story of empires, there are victories that fade and humiliations that never die. The molten fate of Valerian is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a reminder that the higher you build your throne, the further there is to fall. And when gold becomes your god, it will always demand a sacrifice. In the summer of 1305, the city of London prepared for a show. The streets filled with noise, the crowd buzzing with cruel excitement. They had come to witness the end of a man who had once defied an empire. His name was William Wallace, the Scottish knight whose courage had shaken the English crown. To his enemies, he was a traitor. To his people, he was freedom itself. Years earlier, Scotland had been a nation under the boot of England. Its people were taxed, its lands seized, its nobles divided. Then came Wallace, a man of strength and fire, who refused to kneel. He gathered farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds, men who had nothing but courage, and led them into battle. At Stirling Bridge, his small army crushed a much larger English force. For the first time in years, Scotland stood tall. But victory is a fleeting thing. Power breeds betrayal, and betrayal would be the chain that bound him. By 1305, Wallace had been hunted across the countryside. The crown placed a price on his head so high that even loyalty began to waver. He was finally captured near Glasgow, betrayed by one of his own countrymen. The English brought him to London, not for justice, but for spectacle. His trial was short, his sentence already written. He would be made an example warning to anyone who dared dream of freedom again. On August 23rd, Wallace was dragged through the streets behind a horse. The crowd jeered, the dirt clinging to his skin. At Smithfield, he was hanged, but not to death. He was cut down before his last breath could escape. What followed was a ritual of cruelty, an execution designed to erase both man and message. His body was mutilated, dismembered, and burned. His head was dipped in tar and set on a spike above London Bridge, where travelers would see it and remember what rebellion cost. But what the English could never erase was his defiance. Through the pain, Wallace spoke no words of surrender. In his final moments, witnesses said he prayed, not for mercy but for Scotland. The chroniclers who recorded his death wrote that he endured it without a cry, that his silence was louder than any scream. It was as if even his suffering was an act of rebellion. History would later turn his story into legend. The poets called him a hero. The movies called him a martyr. But the truth lies somewhere in between. Wallace was a man flawed, fierce, and unbreakable. He fought not because he believed he could win, but because he could not live kneeling. That kind of courage rarely survives in comfort. It is born in pain, and it dies in fire. When his remains were scattered across the kingdom, the English thought they had destroyed his legacy. Instead, they gave it form. Every village that whispered his name, every soldier who remembered his stand, carried his spirit forward. His body was gone, but his cause was immortal. Even centuries later, when people speak of freedom, his name rises like a spark from the ashes. In the quiet of that London square, as the fire faded and the crowd dispersed, the story of William Wallace had already begun to outlive his flesh. He was a man torn apart by empire, but united in memory. His cry for freedom did not echo in the air that day. It echoed in time. And perhaps that is why legends endure. Because sometimes the world burns a man to silence him, only to find that his silence speaks forever. In the summer of 1514, Hungary was a nation trembling beneath the weight of its own nobility. The rich ruled like gods, the poor bled like animals, and the church called for yet another crusade, this time against the Ottoman Empire. Peasants were promised salvation if they fought. But when the hungry and the desperate gathered under the banner of faith, They began to see the truth. The crusade was not for God. It was for those who already had everything. At the heart of it all stood a soldier named Gheorghe Dosha. He was a must of discipline, courage, and iron will. Born a nobleman of small means, he fought bravely for his country and earned the king's favor. When the crusade was called, Dosha was chosen to lead it. Thousands followed him, farmers, shepherds, minersmen, who owned little but their anger. What began as a holy war became a rebellion. When the nobles refused to feed their armies, the peasants turned their swords not toward the Turks, but toward their own masters. Villages burned, castles fell. For the first time, the powerful felt fear. Dosha, once loyal, now stood against the entire order that had built him. His name became a curse whispered by kings and a prayer whispered by the poor. But revolutions are fragile things. The nobles united, led by a ruthless man named John Zapolya, and crushed the uprising in a single, merciless campaign. Tens of thousands of peasants were slaughtered. The dream of equality was drowned in its own blood. Dosha was captured and brought before Zapolya. The nobleman offered him no trial, only vengeance. He wanted to make an example so horrific that no peasant would ever dare to rise again. Dosha was sentenced to sit upon a throne of iron, heated until it glowed red, a mockery of royalty. A crown of fire was pressed onto his head. A scepter of burning steel was placed in his hands, the air filled with the scent of flesh and smoke. They called it justice. It was torture. As Dosha's body burned, 9 of his starving followers were brought before him. The executioners tore pieces of flesh from his body with hot pincers and threw them into the fire. The peasants were ordered to eat, to prove their loyalty to the nobles who ruled them. Some obeyed out of terror. Others rebuked and were cut to pieces on the spot. The horror of that day lingered long after the flames died. No one knows what Dosha said in his final moments. Some say he cursed the nobles. Others claim he remained silent, his gaze steady, unbroken. What we do know is that his death did not bring peace. It brought a shadow. In the years that followed, the peasants' rage smoldered beneath the soil, waiting for its time. The nobles had won the battle, but they had lost something greater, the right to call themselves human. In Hungary today, Gheorghe Dosha is remembered not as a rebel or a murderer, but as a martyr, a man who stood for justice when justice no longer existed. His iron throne has become a symbol, a reminder of how power deforms mercy and how cruelty can never rule forever. The nobles wrote history that day, but history did not forget what they tried to hide. The story of Dosha is not only about death. It is about the fire that comes when people realize they have nothing left to lose. It is about the courage to sit on a burning throne and still look like a king. And maybe that is why, 5 centuries later, the flames of his defiance still glow. Because though iron cools and emperors fall, the memory of those who stood against tyranny never truly burns away. In the marble halls of ancient Rome, madness often wore a crown. Few emperors proved that. More than Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who once dreamed of a just and noble empire. But where the father saw wisdom, the son saw only glory. And in his pursuit of it, Commodus turned the greatest empire in the world into his personal stage. He was born in gold, raised in luxury, and told from birth that he was destined to rule the world. But power without restraint is poison. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, Commodus ascended the throne at just 18. At first Rome rejoiced. A young emperor, handsome and strong, the promise of a bright new age. Instead, what they got was a nightmare in silk. Commodus loved the arena more than the Senate. He believed himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules, the half-god hero of legend. He fought in the Colosseum dressed in lion skins, wielding a club, demanding that real gladiators fight him and lose. Every match was rigged, every victory staged. The people cheered out of fear, not admiration, and anyone who refused to worship him as a living god soon vanished into the dust. As his delusions grew, so did his cruelty. He renamed Rome after himself, called its citizens Commodians, and declared that every month would be dedicated to one of his divine titles. The senators watched in horror as the empire became a circus. But behind the laughter was terror. Commodus executed his advisors, his generals, even his lovers, convinced that everyone was plotting against him. In the end, he was right, because paranoia has a way of creating its own truth. By the year 192, Rome was drowning in fear. The once mighty emperor had retreated into his fantasies, surrounding himself with sycophants and actors. He planned to start the new year with a grand spectacle, a reenactment of Hercules' triumphs, in which he would appear as the god himself, striking down enemies before the cheering crowd. But one of his closest allies, a woman named Marcia, knew what such madness would bring. She had seen too many die already. So she decided to end it. On the last night of the year, as Commodus prepared for his glorious dawn, Marcia slipped poison into his cup of wine. He drank, laughed, and began to choke. But fate, always dramatic, refused to make it simple. The poison only weakened him. As he gasped for air, a wrestler named Narcissus entered his chamber and strangled him in his bath. The god-king of Rome died not in battle or glory, but alone, naked and forgotten, his crown slipping beneath the water. When dawn came, the city woke to silence. The senators declared his memory cursed, his statues destroyed, his name erased from monuments. But history, ever fond of irony, remembered him anyway. He became the face of a dying age, the moment when Rome stopped being a republic of men and became a theater of gods. Commodus's death was not the end of Rome's madness, only the beginning. His murder unleashed a storm that plunged the empire into chaos. In the next year alone, 5 emperors would rise and fall. The throne became a game of survival, and the empire began its slow descent into shadow. And yet, his story endures, because it asks a question that echoes through every age. What happens when a ruler begins to believe his own legend? When power becomes performance and the crown becomes a costume? Commodus's fall was not just an assassination. It was an unmasking, the final act of a tragedy written by pride and played for the gods. In the quiet after his death, Rome exhaled. The monster was gone, but the rot he left behind would outlive them all. The emperor who thought himself divine became the proof that even gods can drown. For more than 3,000 years, he slept beneath the sands of Egypt, a forgotten boy, buried in gold, waiting for time to find him again. His name was Tutankhamun, the child pharaoh who ruled for less than a decade and died before he became a man. History might have forgotten him entirely, if not for the curse that carried his name across the world. Tutankhamun became king at just 9 years old, inheriting a kingdom in turmoil. His father, the heretic Akhenaten, had defied the gods of Egypt, worshipping only one, the sun disk, Atuan. The old gods were banished, temples abandoned, and the priests stripped of power. When Akhenaten died, chaos followed. The boy king's first task was not to rule, but to restore. He reopened the temples, rebuilt the shrines, and brought back the gods his father had erased. The priests praised him. The people adored him. But behind the golden mask was a child carrying the weight of an empire. He married his half-sister, Ankhesenamun, another child born into power she could not escape. The royal bloodline was tangled and fragile. Tutankhamun was sickly, frail, his body broken by generations of intermarriage. His spine was twisted, his leg deformed, and ancient records hint that he could barely walk without help. Yet in art, he was always shown as perfect, a divine figure, standing tall beside his queen. In life, he was just a boy who loved hunting birds along the Nile. And then, suddenly, he was gone. Barely 19 years old. No one knows how he died. Some say it was an accident, a fall from a chariot. Others whisper of murder, of poison, of power reclaimed by the priests who had once ruled Egypt through faith and fear. His widow, desperate and alone, wrote to foreign kings begging for protection. But she, too, vanished into silence. Tutankhamun's name was erased from official records, his tomb sealed, his story buried beneath centuries of sand. It might have ended there, if not for a man named Howard Carter. In 1922, after years of searching, Carter's team uncovered a staircase hidden beneath the Valley of the Kings. What they found changed history. Behind a sealed door lay chambers untouched since the day of burial, walls shimmering with gold, statues, jewels, chariots, and a coffin carved with the serene face of a boy. For the first time, the world looked into the eyes of Egypt's forgotten king. But with discovery came whispers. Just months after entering the tomb, Lord Carnarvon, the expedition's sponsor, died suddenly from an infected mosquito bite. Newspapers screamed of a curse. Other members of the team fell ill or died under strange circumstances. The legend grew that anyone who disturbed Tutankhamun's rest would suffer his vengeance. Scientists later dismissed it as coincidence, but the myth had already taken root. The curse became more famous than the king himself. In truth, Tutankhamun's curse was never written on the tomb walls. It was something imagined by men who feared what they did not understand. But in a way, the legend gave the boy what life had denied him: immortality. He had ruled for only a few years, but now his name was spoken in every corner of the world. His fragile body, preserved in layers of linen, had become a mirror reflecting humanity's obsession with power, death, and mystery. The irony is that Tutankhamun's curse was never about revenge. It was about memory. The ancient Egyptians believed a person truly died only when their name was no longer spoken. For thousands of years, no one uttered his. Then the curse gave it back. The boy king who was forgotten became eternal. And so, when you look at that golden mask, the calm smile, the endless eyes, remember the child beneath the gold. Tutankhamun was not just a pharaoh. He was a reminder that even in death, stories have power, and that sometimes the dead do not haunt us out of anger, but because they simply do not want to be forgotten. In the glittering halls of 18th century Stockholm, music echoed through chandeliers and velvet curtains. It was the night of the masquerade ball at the Royal Opera House, a night meant for laughter, theater, and escape. But beneath the masks, daggers waited. For King Gustav III of Sweden, it would be his final performance. Gustav was not a typical monarch. He loved the arts more than war, poetry more than politics. He saw himself as a philosopher king, a man who could unite his country not with blood, but with beauty. Under his rule, Sweden flourished with music, theater, and architecture. He even built an entering opera house so that his people could share in his passions. But the same vision that made him adored by some made him despised by others. The nobles saw him as arrogant, reckless, and dangerous. He had stripped them of power, centralized authority, and declared that the crown alone would rule. To the nobility, it was tyranny disguised as enlightenment. To Gustav, it was destiny. He believed in monarchy as theater, every gesture grand, every word rehearsed. He wore costumes that dazzled, spoke as though the world were his audience, and moved through life as if it were a stage. But even the most dazzling performance must one day end. By 1792, whispers filled the corridors of Stockholm. The nobility plotted in silence, masking their hatred behind polite bows. They could not strike in the open. Gustav was too beloved by the common people. So they planned something that would look like an accident of fate. When the king announced a grand masquerade ball at the opera house, his enemies saw their chance. The perfect setting, a crowd, confusion, anonymity. On the night of March 16th, the air inside the opera house shimmered with candlelight and perfume. Music swelled as the king entered in a simple black domino mask and a golden sash. He moved through the crowd, smiling, greeting his guests. None knew that a group of conspirators watched from the shadows, each wearing the same black mask. At the stroke of midnight, one of them stepped forward. His name was Jacob Johann Ankarström. The assassin approached the king, bowed slightly, and whispered, "Bonsoir, beau masque." "Good evening, fine mask." Before Gustav could reply, a pistol flashed. The bullet struck him in the back. The music stopped. The crowd screamed. Ankarström was seized instantly, but it was too late. The king staggered, still conscious, still composed. He raised his hand to calm the chaos, telling his guests that the show must go on. For 13 days, Gustav lingered. His wound became infected, the pain unbearable, but he refused to curse his attackers. From his bed, he continued to dictate letters and decrees, determined that the monarchy would endure beyond his death. When he finally succumbed, his last words were said to be, "God, protect my beloved Sweden." His assassins were captured and executed, but their act would echo through Europe. The death of Gustav III became the end of Sweden's absolute monarchy and the beginning of a new era of politics and suspicion. The theater-loving king had built his world on performance and died in its spotlight. Centuries later, his story inspired plays, operas, and films. Verdi turned his death into the opera Un ballo in Maschera, where tragedy and beauty intertwined just as they had in Wefti. Gustav had once said that to rule was to act, and in the end, he proved himself right. His final act was the most dramatic of all. The masquerade of Gustav III reminds us that even kings cannot escape the roles they create for themselves. That power is performance, and history is the audience. When the mask falls, only truth remains. And somewhere, in the candlelit echoes of that opera house, the music still plays, the last dance of a king who mistook the stage for a throne. In the final days of the French monarchy, the world seemed to turn upside down. Once grand palaces echoed with silence, and the laughter of royalty was replaced by the roar of a furious people. At the heart of it all stood a young woman, whose name would become both legend and curse, Marie Antoinette, the last queen of France. She was born in Vienna, the daughter of the Empress of Austria, and married to the French Prince Louis at just 14. The marriage was meant to seal peace between nations, but what it created instead was isolation. In Versailles, Marie was a foreigner in a golden cage. The courtiers mocked her accents. The people called her extravagant, and the whispers of scandal followed her like perfume. Yet beneath the diamonds and silks was a girl who had never been taught what the world outside her palace truly was. When her husband became King Louis XVI, she became Queen Aurore. She neither wanted nor understood. France was collapsing under debt, its people starving, its government rotting from within. But from Versailles, none of that was visible. The palace was a dream, and she its prisoner. They built gardens the size of cities, hosted feasts while bread vanished from the streets. Rumors began to spread, rumors that she once said, "Let them eat gaiki." She never did. But in the eyes of the hungry, she was the symbol of everything they despised. When revolution came, it came like a storm. The gates of Versailles were torn open by thousands of women armed with kitchen knives and free. The royal family was dragged from their home and imprisoned in Paris. The king, awkward and indecisive, hoped for compromise. Marie, now hardened by fear, began to plan escape. But every plan failed. Every friend betrayed her. One by one, the pillars of monarchy crumbled. The age of kings was dying, and she could hear it in the chanting outside her window. In January 1793, the king was executed by guillotine. The crowd cheered as the blade fell, and the queen, now a widow and prisoner, waited for her turn. She spent her last months in a damp cell, her hair turning white, her children taken from her arms. When the day finally came, October 16th, she dressed in white, the color of mourning, and walked calmly to the scaffold. Witnesses said she moved with dignity, her spine straight, her eyes clear. Even her enemies felt a moment of pity. As she climbed the steps, she accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words were not of anger or fear, but apology. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." Moments later, the blade fell. The crowd roared. And just like that, a queen became history. The revolution called it justice. But time has its own way of rewriting stories. In death, Marie Antoinette became something her enemies could not destroy, a symbol. To some, she was the last gasp of a corrupt world. To others, a victim of its madness. Her letters from prison revealed not a monster, but a mother. A woman stripped of everything yet still holding her head high. Centuries later, her name still carries weight. She is the cautionary tale of existence, the ghost of a world that believed it could last forever. But beneath the legend is a simpler truth. Marie Antoinette was a girl born into power she never asked for, punished for sins she barely understood. In her final moment, surrounded by hatred, she found grace. History remembers her as the queen who lost her head. But maybe she was something else, the last human face of monarchy, caught between the dream of privilege and the reality of revolution. Her fall was not just the end of a dynasty. It was the moment when an entire world finally woke up. And in that awakening, she became immortal, not through luxury, but through tragedy. On the morning of March 15th, 44 years before the birth of Christ, the streets of Rome were filled with whispers. The city's greatest general, Julius Caesar, was preparing to enter the Senate. He had conquered Gaul, defeated Pompey, ended civil war, and now ruled the Roman world. But his rise had been too fast, his crown too heavy, and behind the marble smiles of his allies, betrayal was waiting. Caesar had always been a man who believed in destiny. He said it was better to be first among men than second to the gods. He had turned the republic into a reflection of himself, single man, standing above all others. To his followers, he was the savior of wealth. To his enemies, he was the death of freedom. The Senate had once been a place of debate. Now, it was a stage on which Caesar played the part of a king, and we had sworn long ago never to have another. The night before his death, omens filled the air. His wife Calpurnia dreamed of blood pouring from his statue. The priests warned that the gods were restless. His friends begged him to stay home. But Caesar laughed. "Cowards die many times before their deaths," he said. "The valiant never taste of death but once." It was arrogance, perhaps, or acceptance. Either way, he stepped into history with his eyes open. The Ides of March dawned clear and bright. Caesar walked to the Senate surrounded by men who called him father. Among them were Cassius, Brutus, and dozens of others who had once shared his table. Inside the Senate chamber, the marble floor gleamed white, cold, perfect. As Caesar took his seat, the conspirators closed in. At first it seemed like they were greeting him. Then came the flash of steel. The first dagger struck his neck, then another, then another. He stumbled, caught between shock and fury. "Why, this is violence," he cried. But no one listened. They surrounded him, the Senate echoing with the sound of knives. The man who had crossed rivers and conquered nations could not escape the circle of his friends. When he saw Brutus step forward, the man he loved like a son, Caesar's strength left him. Et tu, Brute, he whispered. And with that, he fell beneath the statue of Pompey, the rival he had once destroyed. For a moment, the world held its breath. Then silence. The senators fled, their robes stained with blood. The body of Julius Caesar lay alone on the marble floor, the great dictator of Rome reduced to a mortal once more. Outside, the city trembled. The conspirators believed they had saved the Republic. Instead, they had killed its last hope for order. What followed was chaos. Rome descended into another civil war. Brutus and Cassius would take their own lives. The republic they fought to preserve crumbled, and from its ashes rose an empire. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, would rule as the first emperor, fulfilling the destiny Caesar had begun. The man they killed to stop monarchy had created it. In death, Caesar became greater than he ever was in life. Temples were built in his honor. The comet that blazed across the sky after his funeral was said to be his soul ascending to the heavens. His name became a title: Caesar, Czar, Kaiser, echoing through centuries. Every tyrant who followed wore the shadow of his ambition. The story of Julius Caesar is not just about power, but about trust. The knife that kills a ruler rarely comes from the hand of an enemy. It comes from a friend. His death marked the end of the Roman Republic and the birth of something far more enduring. The idea that no man, no matter how mighty, can escape the consequences of his own greatness. And so, on every 15th of March, the world remembers not just how he died, but why. Because every empire begins with ambition and ends with betrayal. In the spring of 1431, a 19-year-old girl stood alone in the center of a crowded square in Rouen, France. Chains bound her wrists, smoke curled around her feet. The crowd had come not to see a soldier or a noble, but a girl who claimed she heard the voice of God. Her name was Joan of Arc. And though her enemies would burn her to ashes, they could not silence the fire she carried within. Joan was born in a small village called Domremy, a place of quiet fields and church bells. France at the time was broken, torn apart by the 100 Years' War. The English occupied vast lands, the French king was weak, and the people had lost faith. Then came Joan, a peasant, illiterate, but filled with conviction. At 13, she began to hear voices, she said, of saints commanding her to drive the English from France and crown the true king, Charles of Valois. No one believed her at first, but her courage was undeniable. She traveled hundreds of miles to meet the Dauphin, disguised as a soldier, and demanded an audience. Against all reason, she convinced him. Dressed in armor, carrying a banner instead of a sword, she led men into battle and turned despair into hope. Her presence alone seemed to change the wind of war. Under her command, the siege of Orléans was lifted, a victory so unexpected that even her enemies whispered she was touched by the divine. But the same flame that inspired France began to frighten its leaders. Joan was not noble, not male, not someone they could control. And the church, always wary of miracles it did not own, began to question her. When she was captured by the Burgundians and conned to the English, her allies abandoned her. The king she had helped crown offered no ransom, no rescue. Joan, the savior of France, was left to stand trial for heresy. The trial was a performance, a mockery of justice cloaked in scripture. Dozens of judges questioned her for months, twisting her words, trying to make her confess that her voices were lies or demons. But Joan did not waver. She said she feared only treason, not death. Her answers, written down by her accusers, revealed a mind sharper and stronger than any scholar's. Still, the verdict had already been written. The church could not allow a peasant girl to speak for God. On May 30th, She was led to the stake in the market square. Witnesses said she asked for a cross, and a soldier fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. She held it to her chest as they tied her to the post. When the fire was lit, she cried out once Jesus, and then was gone. The crowd wept, and even the executioner later confessed he Freddie had burned a saint. The ashes of Joan of Arc were thrown into the Seine River, scattered so that no relics could remain. But fire, once lit, has a way of spreading. 25 years later, the Church reversed its judgment. Centuries after that, she was canonized as a saint. Today, statues of her stand across France, not as a warrior or a martyr, but as a symbol of faith, courage, and the strength of conviction. What makes her story endure is not her victories, but her certainty. In a world ruled by men, armies, and kings, Joan believed that truth could come from a single voice. She defied every rule of her age, not for glory, but because she believed she had to. And when the flames took her, they did not consume her, they revealed her light. The story of Joan of Arc is the story of a soul that refused to bend. She burned once in Rouen, but her fire never went out. It still burns wherever someone stands alone, believing in something greater than fear. On a cold February morning in the year 1600, a man was led through the narrow streets of Foy, his mouth bound, his eyes defiant. He walked barefoot, clothed in rags, surrounded by priests who murmured prayers meant to save his soul. His name was Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, poet, and dreamer who had dared to say aloud what others only whispered, that the universe was infinite, that the stars were suns, and that the earth was not the center of it all. For that idea, the world chose to burn him. Bruno was born in Nola, near Naples, in 1548. From an early age, he was restless, unable to accept the limits of Duava. He joined a Dominican monastery, but quickly found himself in trouble for questioning too much. He read forbidden books, studied the works of Copernicus, and began to see the universe not as a closed box of divine order, but as an endless ocean of possibilities. He fled Italy, wandering through Europe for years, teaching, writing, and debating. His words fascinated some and terrified others. Bruno's vision of the cosmos was centuries ahead of his time. He spoke of countless worlds orbiting distant suns, of life beyond Earth, of a God so vast that no church could contain him. To him, creation was not centered on humanity, it was infinite, eternal, alive in every star. But such thoughts were blasphemy to the Church, which demanded a universe built around mankind and its salvation. Bruno did not back down. He refused to trade wonder for obedience. Eventually, his travels brought him back to Italy, where betrayal waited. In 1592, he was arrested by the Inquisition in Venice and later transferred to Foy. For 7 years he was interrogated, tortured, and given countless chances to recant. They wanted him to say, the earth was fixed, that the heavens revolved around it, that his ideas were dreams and nothing more. But Bruno remained silent or smiled. I do not recant, he said. Perhaps you fear more in pronouncing my sentence than I in hearing it. When the final verdict came, he was condemned as a heretic. On the morning of his execution, they led him to the Campo dei Fiori, the Square of Flowers. It was ironic there would be no flowers that day, only fire. As they tied him to the stake, he looked at the priests and said, You are more afraid than I am. The flames rose, the smoke curled, and the philosopher of the stars vanished into light. Bruno's books were banned. His name was erased from records. For centuries, he was remembered not as a scientist, but as a warning, a reminder of what happened to those who defied faith with thought. But time, as always, is a patient judge. The world he imagined, once condemned as heresy, became the foundation of modern astronomy. The stars he dreamed of are now mapped. The worlds he envisioned are now found. In Rome today, in that same square where he burned, a bronze statue of Giordano Bruno stands tall, cloaked and unbowed, his gaze fixed toward the Vatican. The base reads simply, "To Bruno from the century he foresaw." His prophecy was not of doom, but of freedom, the freedom to think, to question, to imagine a universe without walls. Giordano Bruno's death was not the end of his ideas. It was the proof that truth cannot be silenced by flaming. He believed that the universe was infinite, and so was the human spirit. Perhaps that is why, when we look up at the stars, we still hear a faint whisper, reminding us that every spark of curiosity is sacred, and that even those who burn for their beliefs can light the way for the rest of us. In the year 415, on the sunlit coast of Egypt, Alexandria stood as the jewel of the ancient world. Its towering library had once held all the knowledge of mankind, and its scholars had walked among the stars through words and thought. But by then, the great city had begun to fade. The old gods were dying, the new faith rising, and between them stood one woman, a philosopher, mathematician, and a teacher named Hypatia. She was the last light of an age that was about to be extinguished. Hypatia was born into wisdom. Her father, Theon, was a scholar at the Library of Alexandria, one of the last to keep its traditions alive. From him, she inherited not only knowledge, but a love of truth itself. In a world where women were meant to be silent, Hypatia spoke. She lectured on mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy, drawing students from across the Mediterranean. To those who came to hear her, she was not just a teacher, but a symbol of reason, of beauty, of the ancient world refusing to die. Her presence was magnetic. Dressed in simple robes, she rode through the city in a chariot, her mind sharper than any blade. Even the powerful sought her counsel. Among her students was Orestes, the governor of Alexandria, a man caught in a political war with the city's Christian bishop, Cyril. Hypatia, who believed in logic over faith, became the target of both sides. To some, she was the embodiment of pagan knowledge. To others, a witch, a seductress, a threat to divine order. Rumors spread that she used magic, that her wisdom was blasphemy, that she stood between the bishop and the God's will. In truth, she stood for something far simpler, the right to think freely. But in an age where thought itself was dangerous, that was enough to mark her for death. One day, as she rode home from her lectures, a mob of fanatics intercepted her chariot. They dragged her through the streets to the steps of a church, the very place where mercy was supposed to dwell. There, they stripped her, beat her, and tore her apart with shards of pottery. When it was done, they burned what was left of her body, as if fire could erase knowledge. Alexandria, once the cradle of enlightenment, had devoured its last philosopher. Her death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an era, the final breath of the ancient world, before the long darkness of the Middle Ages. The city that had once lit the world now smoldered in ignorance and fear. Yet even in that darkness, Hypatia's light never truly went out. Centuries later, her name would return, whispered by scholars and scientists who carried her dream forward. She became a symbol of reason against fanaticism, of intellect against cruelty. The Renaissance would look back and see her as a martyr for knowledge, a woman born too soon and too wise for her time. Hypatia of Alexandria lived in a world that could not accept her brilliance, but her legacy survived every flame, every lie, every silence. She taught that the pursuit of truth is worth any price, that the human mind, once awakened, cannot be chained. And so, though her body was destroyed, her light endures. Each time a question is asked in defiance of fear, each time a voice speaks for reason against the mob, Hypatia's spirit rises once more. The last light of ancient wisdom still burns, not in the marble halls of Alexandria, but in the minds of all who dared to seek the truth. In the winter of 1170, the stone halls of Canterbury Cathedral echoed with prayers and candlelight. Outside, snow fell over England, silent and pure. Inside, blood would soon stain the floor of the house of God. The man who would die there was Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, once the closest friend of King Henry II, now his greatest rival. Their story began with loyalty and ended with a sword drawn in the name of faith and power. Thomas Becket was not born into nobility. He was the son of a London merchant, clever and ambitious, who rose through wit and charm rather than birth. Henry, the young and brilliant king, saw in him a kindred spirit. He made Becket his chancellor, his companion, his trusted ally. Together they dreamed of a kingdom ruled by both strength and reason. Henry believed he had found not just a servant, but another version of himself. And then, he made a decision that would destroy them both. When the seat of Archbishop of Canterbury fell vacant, Henry appointed Becket, thinking his friend would bring the church under royal control. But Becket changed. The moment he put on the robes of the church, he laid down the crown of ambition. He became a man of God first, a servant of the king second. Where Henry demanded obedience, Becket demanded principle. Where Henry saw loyalty, Becket saw duty. Their friendship fractured under the weight of power. For years they fought over who ruled England, the throne, or the altar. Henry saw Becket's defiance as betrayal. Becket saw the king's anger as temptation. Their quarrel turned to open hostility, and Becket was forced into exile. When he returned, it was with hope of peace. But peace was no longer possible. One night, in a fit of rage, Henry shouted words that would echo through eternity. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 knights took that as a royal command. On December 29th, as vespers rang through the cathedral, the knights burst through the doors. Becket stood before the altar, his robes glimmering in the candlelight. The priests around him fled, but he did not move. The knights demanded he submit to the king. He refused. "I am ready to die," he said, "for my Lord, that in my blood the church may gain liberty and peace." The first blow struck his shoulder. The next split his skull. As his blood spread across the stone floor, the bells of Canterbury continued to ring. The knights fled into the darkness. Henry, when he learned of the murder, locked himself away for days, torn by guilt. Across Europe, the news spread like fire. The man who had been a king's friend became a martyr. Miracles were said to occur at his tomb. Pilgrims came from every corner of Christendom to pray where he fell. Within 3 years, the church declared him a saint. Thomas Becket's death became one of the defining moments of the Middle Ages. It reminded kings that their power had limits, that even thrones must bow before conscience. His name became a symbol of resistance, not only to tyranny, but to the corruption of faith itself. The cathedral where he died became a place of healing and a warning to every ruler who believed himself above God. 8 centuries later, the stones of Canterbury still remember. Pilgrims still walk its aisles, following the path of a man who chose conviction over comfort, sacrifice over silence. Becket's life was a tragedy born of friendship, pride, and belief. But his death became something greater, a bridge between heaven and earth, built from courage and blood. In that final moment, surrounded by steel and faith, Thomas Becket proved a truth older than kings, that no sword can silence a soul that dies for what is right. In the quiet chambers of the Holy Inquisition, an old man stood before his judges. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from age. His eyes, once sharp enough to see the moons of Jupiter, were now clouded with sorrow. His name was Galileo Galilei, the man who dared to look through a telescope and tell the church that the heavens did not move around the earth. The Church would forgive many sins, but not that one. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564, into a world still bound by ancient beliefs. The earth, people said, was the center of creation. The sun, stars and planets circled it in divine perfection. Questioning that was not just science, it was heresy. But Galileo was a man who could not stop asking questions. He built his own telescopes, turning glass and curiosity into revelation. What he saw shattered centuries of certainty. He saw that the moon was not smooth, but scarred like the earth. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything revolved around us. And when he watched Venus change its phases like the moon, he realized that Copernicus had been right. The earth moved around the sun. The heavens were not perfect. The universe was vast, dynamic, alive. At first, he was celebrated. Princes and scholars marveled at his discoveries. Even the Pope admired his work. But truth has a way of making enemies. As his fame grew, so did resentment. The Church saw his ideas as a threat to order, a crack in the foundation of a divine authority. If the earth was not the center of creation, what did that say about mankind? About God? Galileo did not mean to challenge faith-only ignorance, but in doing so, he challenged power. In 1633, he was summoned to Rome to face the Inquisition. The trial was swift, the outcome predetermined. Surrounded by cardinals and inquisitors, Galileo was forced to kneel and recant his beliefs. He denied that the earth moved, denied the very truth he had seen with his own eyes. History says that when he rose, he whispered 4 words under his breath, "Et pour se mouve." And yet, it moves. Whether he truly said them or not, they became immortal, the quiet rebellion of science against silence. Galileo was spared execution, but not freedom. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest, his books banned, his telescope taken away. Yet even in captivity, his mind remained boundless. He continued to write, to think, to dream of a universe that no prison could contain. When he died in 1642, blind and weary, the Church refused to let him be buried beside his ancestors. His body, like his ideas, had to wait for acceptance. Centuries later, the Church would admit its error. Galileo's name would be restored, his discoveries celebrated as the foundation of modern astronomy. The very institution that silenced him would one day use his science to mark its own time, building observatories to gaze upon the stars he once saw alone. Galileo's story is not one of a defeat. It is a reminder that truth does not need permission to exist. It may be buried, mocked, or punished, but it endures. Every orbit of the earth, every samaisi, every night skies is a quant vindication of his courage. He taught us that belief and understanding need not be enemies, but that when power fears knowledge, darkness grows. And so, when you look at the stars tonight, remember the old man who saw what others refused to see. The man who whispered to eternity that the earth moves, and that truth, once seen, can never again be unseen. In the early hours of July 17, 1918, a dim basement in the Russian city of Yekaterinburg echoed with quiet whispers and the shuffle of boots. The Romanov family, the last imperial dynasty of Russia, stood together for the final time. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were told they were being moved for their safety. But the truth was already written in the cold air of that cellar. The empire they ruled for 3 centuries was gone. The age of crowns had ended. Nicholas had never been a cruel man, but he was not a strong one. He inherited a nation vast and restless, ruled by faith, tradition, and fear. While Europe raced into the modern age, Russia remained bound by poverty and superstition. The Tsar believed in divine right, in the idea that he ruled because God wished it so. But even divine faith cannot feed the hungry. or Silence Revolution. The first cracks appeared in blood. In 1905, his soldiers opened fire on peaceful protesters in St. Petersburg, killing hundreds. Bloody Sunday, they called it, and the name followed him forever. Then came war. In 1914, Nicholas led his country into World War I, a war it could not win. Millions died. Cities starved. His people turned against him. His own army lost faith. And in 1917, amid chaos and hunger, the Tsar was forced to abdicate, ending more than 300 years of Romanov rule. At first, the family was exiled quietly. They lived under guard, reading books, praying, trying to believe that someday they might return to St. Petersburg. But the world had changed. Lenin's revolution swept across Russia, and the new Bolshevik government saw the Romanovs not as people, but as symbols. So long as they lived, monarchists could dream of restoration. So the order was given. The Romanov family must die. That night, they were woken from sleep and led downstairs to what was said to be a safe room. The walls were white, the air heavy. Nicholas carried his sickly son, Alexei, in his arms. His daughters Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia followed quietly. A firing squad of Bolshevik soldiers entered. The commander read the sentence. Nicholas barely had time to answer before the gunfire began. The first shots echoed like thunder in the small room. The Tsar and his wife fell instantly, but the children did not. Hidden beneath their clothes were diamonds sewn into their corsets, family jewels, meant to fund their escape. The stones turned into armor, deflecting the bullets. The soldiers panicked. They fired again, then used bayonets and rifle butts. When it was over, silence returned. The last Romanovs were gone. Their bodies were buried in a shallow grave, covered with acid to hide the evidence. For decades, the Soviet Union denied the killings, calling them rumor and propaganda. But the truth always finds its way to the surface. In 1991, after the fall of the USSR, the remains of the Romanovs were finally discovered and identified through DNA testing. In 1998, they were buried in St. Petersburg, in the Cathedral of Saints Peter and Paul, the resting place of their ancestors. The family that had died in secret was finally laid to rest with honor. The fall of the Romanovs was not just the end of a dynasty, it was the end of an age. Their deaths marked the death of divine monarchy itself. The crown, the throne, the belief that one family could rule by the will of heaven, all of it perished in that basement. And yet, their story endures. It is a story of fragility, the fragility of power, of privilege, of human illusion. Nicholas and Alexandra were not monsters. They were dreamers trapped in a crumbling world. Parents trying to protect their children while the ground collapsed beneath them. Their tragedy was not that they were hated, but that they could not see the world had changed until it was too late. In that small dark room, an empire died. But in its silence, a warning was born: no throne, no crown, no name lasts forever. When history decides to move on, it does not knock. It simply opens the door, and everything that once seemed eternal becomes a memory. In the heat of a Parisian summer, on July 28, 1794, a man once hailed as the incorruptible guardian of liberty was led to the guillotine. His face was pale, his jaw shattered by a failed suicide attempt, his once commanding voice now a whisper. The crowd cheered as the blade was raised. His name was Maximilien Robespierre. The man who had given birth to the reign of terror and was now to become its final victim. Robespierre was not born into power. He was a lawyer from Arras, small, serious, idealistic. When the French Revolution began in 1789, he was one of its purest believers. He dreamed of equality, justice, and a new order built on reason instead of privilege. He spoke softly, but with conviction. and his words carried like fire. To the poor, he was a prophet. To the powerful, he was a threat. As France tore down its monarchy, Robespierre rose, carried by the wave of revolution. But revolutions are storms. They do not build, they destroy. And as chaos consumed the country, Robespierre convinced himself that only fear could preserve freedom. Virtue without terror, he said, is powerless. Under his leadership, the Committee of Public Safety was formed to protect the Republic from enemies both foreign and domestic. The guillotine became its symbol. At first, it fell on kings and traitors. Then on anyone who dared to disagree. Every dawn brought new executions. Nobles, priests, journalists, even former revolutionaries, all accused of conspiracy, all condemned without mercy. Robespierre called it purification. The people called it madness. He believed he was saving France. In truth, he was feeding the machine of death he had created. The same ideals that once made him loved, now made him feared. His name, once a banner of hope, became a whisper of dread. By the summer of 1794, the bloodlust had gone too far. The National Convention, once obedient, began to turn. Robespierre's allies deserted him, terrified they would be next. On July 27th, he tried to speak in the assembly, but his voice was drowned by shouts of "tyrant." He fled to the Hôtel de Ville with his closest followers. That night, as soldiers closed in, he attempted to take his own life but failed. The bullet shattered his jaw. At dawn, he was captured. The next day, without trial, Robespierre was brought to the same guillotine that had claimed so many in his name. His brother, his friends, his lieutenants all were executed before him. When his turn came, the executioner tore off the bandage from his jaw, and a scream escaped, a sound that echoed across the square. Moments later, the blade fell, and silence followed. The crowd cheered not for justice, but for release. The death of Robespierre marked the end of the reign of terror. In less than a year, more than 16,000 people had been executed in France, and countless others died in prisons. The revolution had devoured itself, and the man who once claimed to defend virtue had become its victim. History's irony was complete. Today, Robespierre remains one of the most complex figures in history, half visionary, half monster. He fought for the rights of the poor, abolished slavery, and defended democracy, yet also believed that death was an acceptable tool for virtue. To some, he was a martyr of ideals. To others, the first dictator of modern times. Perhaps he was both. His story is not just about politics, it is about conviction. The belief that one can shape the world so completely that mercy becomes a weakness. But every revolution that worships purity ends in blood. Every blade raised for justice eventually finds its master. As the guillotine fell on Robespierre, the crowd shouted with joy, but beneath the noise lingered a single question. How long before the next revolution begins? Because history, like the blade, always waits for another fall. On the night of April 14th, 1865, the city of Washington glowed with celebration. The Civil War was over. After 4 long, brutal years, the Union had triumphed. Families filled the streets, soldiers sang in the taverns, and inside Ford's Theater, the President of the United States smiled for the first time in years. Abraham Lincoln had come to watch a play, Our American Cousin. It was to be an evening of peace. Instead, it became one of history's darkest nights. Lincoln had carried the weight of a divided nation on his shoulders. Born in a log cabin, self-taught, awkward, and humble, he rose not by privilege, but by the quiet strength of principle. He believed that a nation built on freedom could not endure half slave and half free. His presidency became a crucible of war, grief, and unrelenting faith. The war had cost more American lives than any before or since, and through it all, Lincoln bore the guilt of every fallen son, as if they were his own. By April 1865, the fighting had ended. The Confederate armies had surrendered, and Lincoln's vision of unity seemed within reach. He dreamed of reconciliation, not revenge of a country reborn from its wounds, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He had said in his second inaugural address. But even as he spoke of peace, hatred still lurked in the shadows. One of those shadows had a name, John Wilkes Booth, a famous actor and fervent Confederate sympathizer. Booth saw Lincoln not as a savior, but as a tyrant who had destroyed the South. He believed that killing the president would avenge the Confederacy and revive its cause. For weeks, he plotted with others to kidnap or assassinate key members of the government. When news of the Confederate surrender came, Booth decided that if the South had lost the war, it would at least win the final act. That night, as the play began, Lincoln sat with his wife Mary in the presidential box above the stage. Laughter echoed through the theater as the audience relaxed in the warmth of victory. At around 10:15 p.m., Booth entered the box from behind, armed with a small pistol and a knife. He waited for a line in the play that always drew laughter, then fired a single shot into the back of the president's head. Lincoln slumped forward without a sound. Mary screamed. Booth leapt onto the stage, shouting, "Sic semper tyrannistus, always to tyrants," and fled into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a small boarding house where doctors worked through the night, but the wound was mortal. He never regained consciousness. At 7:22 a.m. the next morning, April 15th, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. A nation that had just learned to stop fighting began to weep. The news spread like wildfire. Church bells tolled across the country. People knelt in the streets, sobbing openly. The man who had freed millions from bondage had been killed by one who could not bear to see freedom shared. Booth was hunted down and killed 12 days later. His body burned in a barn like the hatred he carried. Lincoln's death became more than tragedy. It became transformation. In life, he was a president. In death, he became a symbol. The poet Walt Whitman called him the sweetest, wisest soul of all my days. Generations would see in him the embodiment of America's highest ideals: humility, mercy, and the courage to stand alone for what is right. Even now, the image of that night remains. The flicker of candlelight, the sound of laughter turning to screams, the stillness that followed. It was the moment when a dreamer's heart stopped, but his vision did not. Because the America he imagined, a nation bound not by blood, but by belief, did not die with him. It was only just beginning. And perhaps that is why Abraham Lincoln's ghost is said to still walk the halls of the White House, not in vengeance, but in vigilance, watching, waiting, reminding us that freedom, like faith, must always be guarded, even from ourselves. History rarely remembers the hands that carry out its orders. It remembers kings, revolutions, and the weight of decisions, but not the men who must live with them. On the night of July 17, 1918, in a small basement in Yekaterinburg, Russia, one such man stood trembling before the Tsar and his family. His name was Yakov Yurovsky. He was the commandant of the execution squad, and as he loaded his pistol, he realized that in obeying the revolution, he was about to lose his soul. Yurovsky was no monster. He was a loyal Bolshevik, a believer in equality and progress, raised in a world where the rich lived in palaces and the poor starved in silence. To him, the Romanovs were not people. They were the symbol of that injustice. For months he had guarded them in captivity, watching the former emperor, Nicholas, read to his children and pray each night. With his wife, Alexandra, he saw them as humans, but the revolution saw them as ghosts that had to be erased. The order to execute came suddenly, signed by the Ural Soviet and approved by Moscow. Yurovsky was told the prisoners would be killed immediately to prevent their rescue by advancing royalist forces. He prepared the room himself, a small, whitewashed basement, with a single light bulb. He instructed his men to act swiftly, cleanly, without cruelty. But there is no clean way to end a dynasty. At 2 in the morning, he woke the family and told them they were being moved to another location for safety. The Tsar dressed quickly, carrying his sickly son Alexei in his arms. His daughters followed, carrying small bundles of belongings. They entered the basement quietly, confused but calm. Yurovsky read the death sentence aloud. In view of the fact that your relatives continue their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas managed only a stunned, "What?" before the guns opened fire. The room filled with smoke and chaos. Bullets ricocheted off the walls. The Tsar and his wife fell first. The daughters screamed. The soldiers, panicking, realized their bullets were not killing the girls. The jewels sewn into their corsets acted as armor. They fired again. Bayonets were used. When it was over, silence returned, broken only by Yurovsky's voice, giving orders to clear the room. He worked methodically. He made sure the bodies were burned, buried, and hidden in the forest. He reported to Moscow that the task was complete. The revolution had no use for ceremony. No witnesses. No graves. Only silence. Yurovsky had done his duty. But that night would follow him for the rest of his duty. In later years, he tried to explain it as necessity. He told interviewers that he felt no hatred for the family, that he was merely obeying the will of history. Yet his diary betrays something deeper, a quiet guilt that never left him. He wrote of how the youngest daughter's body was still warm when he lifted it, how Nicholas's face looked peaceful, how the children had clung to one another in fear. He described burning their clothes, cleaning the blood, erasing every trace. But memory cannot be erased. Yurovsky lived long enough to see the revolution he served twist into tyranny. He watched men like himself disappear into prisons or graves, victims of the same ideology they had once enforced. He died in 1930, a forgotten bureaucrat, buried without honors. But his name, forever tied to that basement, survived. Because sometimes history remembers the hands after all. The story of Yakov Yurovsky is not one of heroism or villainy. It is a story of obedience, the kind that demands a man set aside his humanity for a cause. He believed he was killing a symbol, but he killed a family. And in doing so, he became a symbol himself. The proof that revolutions do not end cruelty. They only change its direction. When we speak of justice and equality, we must remember him. The man who did his duty, and in doing so, ensured that duty would haunt him forever. In the frozen heart of Russia, at the twilight of an empire, there lived a man who refused to die. His name was Grigory Rasputin, a peasant, a mystic, a prophet to some and a devil to others. To the royal family, he was a savior. To their enemies, he was the poison that brought the Romanovs to ruin. His life was strange enough to be legend. But it was his death that turned him into myth. Rasputin was born in a small Siberian village in 869. From the beginning, he seemed touched by something otherworldly. As a boy, he claimed to see visions. He healed sick animals with his hands. People whispered that Godor, something darker, walked beside him. In his 20s, he left home and wandered across Russia as a pilgrim, visiting monasteries, preaching, gaining followers. He was wild, unwashed, magnetic. When he spoke, people listened. When he prayed, they swore miracles happened. His path led him to St. Petersburg, the glittering capital of the Russian Emperor, where he met Tsarina Alexandra, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. Her son, Alexei, the heir to the throne, suffered from a deadly blood disorder. No doctor could help him until Rasputin prayed by the boy's bedside, and the bleeding stopped. To the desperate Tsarina, it was divine intervention. Rasputin became her confidant, her healer, her holy man. But his rise would come at a terrible cost. The nobles of the Russian court despised him. They saw a filthy peasant sitting at the right hand of the Tsarina, whispering counsel in her ear. Rumors spread of scandal, corruption, and sin. Rasputin drank heavily, visited brothels, and boasted that his touch could purify even the impure. To his followers, he was a man of God who lived among sinners. To his enemies, he was the devil wearing a cross. Either way, he had become too powerful to ignore. By 1916, with Russia collapsing under the weight of war and famine, a group of nobles decided that killing Rasputin would save the empire. Led by Prince Felix Yusupov, they invited him to a dinner at the Moika Palace on a snowy December night. The plan was simple: poison him, watch him die, bury him before dawn. But nothing about Rasputin was simple. They offered him wine and cakes laced with cyanide. He ate and drank and smiled. Hours passed, and he remained alive. Panic set in. Yusupov retrieved a revolver and shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell. The conspirators left the room, thinking it was over. When Yusupov returned, Rasputin's eyes opened. He lunged forward, clawing his way toward the door. Another shot struck him down. Then another. Still, he crawled into the courtyard, gasping into the cold air. Only after they threw his body into the icy Neva River did he finally stop moving. When his corpse was found days later, his lungs were filled with water. He had drowned. The poison, the bullets, the beatings, they had all failed. Death had killed him only when the river froze over him. It was as if the man who had haunted Russia in life refused to leave it even in death. Within a year, the Tsar and his family were executed, and the empire Rasputin had influenced collapsed into revolution. His murderers fled or died. His name became legend, his story retold in every tavern and palace across Europe. Some called him a demon, others a martyr. The truth lies somewhere in between. He was not a monster born of darkness, nor a saint of light. He was a mirror, reflecting the madness of a world on the edge of its own destruction. Rasputin's death became the symbol of an immense end. His killers thought they were saving Russia, but they were only burying its last illusion of control. The man who wouldn't die became the ghost that history could never silence. His story still echoes through time, a warning of how fear and faith can twist together until they become indistinguishable. And so, the peasant who rose to touch the throne met his end in the frozen waters of St. Petersburg. Yet his eyes, pale and unblinking, still seem to look back from the depths, as if even now he refuses to stay dead. In a quiet Paris laboratory at the turn of the 20th century, a woman worked by candlelight long after the city had gone to sleep. Her hands were raw, her toes burned with faint stains that shimmered blue in the dark. Around her were piles of black rock and fragile glass vials that glowed faintly, as though holding starlight. Her name was Marie Curie. The light she discovered would change the world and one day take her life. Marie was born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw, Poland, in 1867. Her childhood was shaped by hardship. Her family was poor, her homeland under Russian rule, and her only escape was knowledge. She studied in secret because women were not allowed to attend university. When she finally moved to Paris, she was hungry, cold, and nearly invisible. But she refused to give up. At the Sorbonne, she studied physics by day and tutored by night, surviving on bread and dreams. It was in that world of equations and solitude that she met Pierre Curie, a fellow scientist whose quiet kindness matched her determination. Together, they formed a partnership unlike any other, two minds drawn not by romance alone, but by curiosity. They married in 1895, and soon after began a quest that would make them immortal. In 1898, After years of crushing ore and endless calculations, they discovered two new elements, polonium and radium. The latter gave off a strange ghostly glow that fascinated them both. They called it radioactivity. The discovery was nothing short of magic. It challenged every rule of science. The atom, once thought to be indivisible, was alive with energy. That invisible power would one day light cities, heal the sick, and destroy worlds. But in those early years, the Curies worked without protection, unaware that the very thing they studied so lovingly was slowly poisoning them. When Pierre was killed in a tragic street accident in 1906, Marie's world collapsed. Yet she returned to her work within weeks, continuing their experiments alone. In 1911, she became the first person in history to win 2 Nobel Prizes, one in physics and one in chemistry. But her triumph came at a cost. The radiation that filled her lab had already begun to change her body. She suffered from constant exhaustion, burns that would not heal, and bleeding that no doctor could explain. She carried vials of radium in her pockets, enchanted by their beauty, unaware that the light she adored was slowly consuming her. During World War I, she turned her discoveries toward life instead of death. She designed mobile X-ray units, tiny radiology stations that could be driven to the front lines. She trained nurses, operated machines herself, and saved thousands of soldiers. They called them Little Curies. She never sought recognition, only purpose. Her courage shone brighter than the very radium that glowed in her lab. By the 1930s, her health had declined beyond repair. Her hands trembled. Her eyesight faded. The notebooks she used, now kept in lead boxes, still emit radiation to this day. On July 4, 1934, Marie Curie died from aplastic anemia, caused by years of exposure to the elements she had discovered. The glow of radium, so pure, so beautiful, had found its creator. And yet, her death was not in vain. Her discoveries opened the door to modern medicine, physics, and nuclear science. Every cancer patient treated with radiation, every image produced by an X-ray, carries the legacy of her sacrifice. She once said, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood." In the end, her understanding came at the highest price. Marie Curie's story is not a tragedy. It is a testament to devotion, the willingness to risk everything for the pursuit of truth. She followed the light into the unknown and became part of it. The woman who held starlight in her hands left behind a legacy that still glows, not with danger, but with hope. In a small suburban home outside Manchester, on a quiet June morning in 1954, a man was found dead beside a half-eaten apple. The official report said, "Suicide by cyanide." But the truth behind that apple was far heavier than poison. The man was Alan Turing, mathematician, cryptanalyst, and leader of the modern computer. He had helped save the world from tyranny, only for that same world to destroy him. Turing was born in London in 1912, a child of restless intelligence. From an early age, he saw patterns where others saw chaos. He loved numbers, puzzles, and logic more than people. He was brilliant, but strange, awkward in speech, blunt in thought, and endlessly curious. At Cambridge, he built his reputation as a visionary mathematician, exploring ideas that most could barely grasp. His concept of a universal machine, capable of performing any calculation, given enough time and instructions, would one day become the foundation of modern computing. But history would remember him first for a different kind of code. In 1939, when war engulfed Europe, Turing was recruited to Bletchley Park, Britain's top-secret code-breaking center. His task was nearly impossible: to break the German Enigma cipher, the machine that encrypted Nazi communications. Each day, it produced billions of combinations, changing constantly. To most, it was unbreakable. To Turing, it was a challenge. He designed a machine called the bomb, an electromechanical marvel that could test thousands of settings every second. By 1941, he and his team had cracked Enigma. Their work shortened the war by years and saved millions of lives. But no one could know. The operation remained classified, and Turing's heroism stayed hidden behind silence. After the war, the world he helped save began to change. He continued his research in mathematics and artificial intelligence, asking questions that still define our age. Can machines think? What makes thought human? But even as his mind looked toward the future, society dragged him backward. In 1952, he was arrested not for espionage, not for treason, but for sortie. He was gay, and in post-war Britain, that was a crime. The court gave him a choice: prison or chemical castration. He chose the latter, believing it would allow him to continue his work. The hormones destroyed his body, dulled his mind, and left him broken. The government that had once depended on his brilliance now branded him a deviant. He lost his security clearance, his position, and his dignity. 2 years later, he was dead. The apple beside his bed became a symbol. Some say he laced it with cyanide, his final act of quiet defiance. Others believe it was an accident, a trace of the chemicals he used in his experiments. Still, the image endures: the mind that unlocked the world, brought low by its own cruelty. Decades later, the same symbol would appear on computers across the globe. Bitten but bright, a silent tribute to the man who made machines think. In 2009, after years of petitions, the British government formally apologized for his treatment. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a royal pardon. But no apology could restore the years stolen or the pain endured. Turing's story is a reminder that genius is fragile, and that progress often demands more courage from individuals than from nations. Today, every digital message, every algorithm, every code that runs our modern lives carries his fingerprint. He gave us a new language, the logic of zeros and ones, of questions and answers. He once wrote, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done." He never lived to see how far his vision would reach. Alan Turing's death was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of ours. His machines learned to think, and in their circuits, his mind still speaks. The world that once condemned him now runs on his imagination. In the winter of 1943, in a small hotel room in New York City, an old man sat alone with a notebook, scribbling formulas no one would ever read. The curtains were drawn, the lights dim. On the bedside table sat a note warning, "Do not disturb." For 2 days, no one entered. When the maid finally did, she found him lifeless, his hands folded as if in prayer. His name was Nikola Tesla the man, who gave the world light, only to die in darkness. Tesla was born in 1852 in a small village in what is now Croatia. From childhood, he saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. He claimed that ideas came to him fully formed, flashing like lightning in his mind. He saw patterns in storms, music in machines. He could memorize entire books, calculate complex equations in his head, and visualize inventions without ever drawing them. But genius, as history shows, is often a lonely companion. After studying engineering in Europe, Tesla moved to America with little more than a letter of introduction to Thomas Edison. He found work in Edison's lab, but quickly clashed with the famous inventor. Edison believed in hard work and trial by fire. Tesla believed in vision and precision. Their disagreement over electrical systems, Edison's direct current versus Tesla's alternating current, would define the future of power itself. Tesla's design won. The world's cities would glow with alternating current, carried across continents by invisible rivers of electricity. But victory brought him little peace. Tesla's mind leapt faster than his era could follow. He dreamed of wireless energy, global communication, machines that could capture power from the air. He built towers that hummed with electricity and prototypes that danced with blue light. Investors came and went, dazzled but impatient. His inventions made others rich, but not him. He was cheated, copied, and forgotten by the very world he was trying to illuminate. As the years passed, Tesla grew eccentric. He lived in hotels, feeding pigeons, working through the nights. He claimed to communicate with them, calling one white pigeon his closest friend. "I loved that pigeon," he said once, "as a man loves a woman." When she died, he said, a light went out in his life. His experiments continued in isolation death rays, wireless power, vibrations that could split the earth. Whether these were breakthroughs or fantasies, no one can say. The line between genius and madness had blurred. By the time he died, Tesla was penniless. The world that had once hailed him as a wizard now dismissed him as a relic. The government seized his papers, fearing secret weapons hidden in his notes. Most of what he created was lost, some destroyed, some locked away. The man who had lit the world was buried in a modest grave, his funeral attended by few. And yet, time, as always, reveals the truth. The alternating current that powers every home, the radio that transmits every voice, the wireless signals that bind our world, all trace their origins to his imagination. He saw a future filled with energy flowing freely, a world connected by invisible waves. He dreamed of technology not as a tool of profit, but as a gift to humanity. Nikola Tesla once said, "The present is theirs. The future, for which I have really worked, is mine." He was right. His name now stands as a symbol of innovation, his life a warning about how easily the world forgets those who build it. In the end, the man who gave us light died in shadow, but his brilliance never dimmed. It hums in every wire, glows in every bulb, pulses through every circuit. The forgotten visionary became eternal, not through wealth or fame, but through the quiet, enduring spark of genius. In July of 1937, the world waited breathlessly as a single airplane vanished into the endless blue of the Pacific. A woman's voice crackled over the radio, faint and uncertain, then faded into static. "We are running north and south." Those were her final words. The pilot was Amelia Earhart, the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic, the daring spirit who had touched the sky and inspired millions. Her disappearance remains one of the greatest mysteries in history. Amelia was born in Kansas in 1897, in an age when girls were taught to keep their feet on the ground. But even as a child, she was drawn to the wind. She climbed trees, built makeshift sleds, and imagined herself soaring through clouds. During World War I, she served as a nurse's aide, caring for wounded soldiers. The sight of courage and loss lit something inside her, hunger to live boldly, to push beyond every boundary set for her. Her first flight came by chance. In 1920, she paid $10 for a 10-minute plane ride. The moment the wheels left the earth, she said she knew her life had changed forever. She learned to fly soon after, saving every penny to buy her first biplane, a bright yellow Kinner Airster she named the Canary. Her passion became her purpose. She broke altitude records, speed records, and barriers far heavier than gravity. In 1932, she crossed the Atlantic alone, battling storms, exhaustion, and mechanical failure. When she landed in Ireland, cold and covered in oil, a farmer asked if she had come far. She smiled and said, "From America." Overnight, she became a legenda symbol of courage, freedom, and the rising power of women. But Amelia was never satisfied with what she had already done. She wanted to circle the world. Her final journey began in June 1937. The plan was to fly around the equator, 29,000 miles, across oceans and continents. She was joined by navigator Fred Noonan, a skilled but troubled man. The first stages went well. They crossed Africa, India, and the vast Pacific, landing at tiny islands along the way. But on July 2nd, as they approached Howland Island, a speck of land barely visible from the air, everything went wrong. Clouds thickened. Radio signals failed. Fuel ran low. The U.S. Coast Guard ship waiting below never saw her. At 8:43 a.m., her final transmission came through, calm but urgent. "We are running north and south." Then silence. The search that followed was the largest in history at the time, hundreds of planes and ships scouring the ocean. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no trace. It was as if the ski had simply swallowed her whole. Over the years, theories multiplied. Some said she crashed at sea. Others claimed she landed on a remote island and died a castaway. A few believed she was captured, or that she lived in secret under another name. None of it could be proven. The mystery became her monument. She had set out to conquer the earth, and instead, she became part of its legend. Amelia Earhart once said, "Adventure is worthwhile in itself." Her life was proof of that. She lived without fear, without apology, always looking toward the horizon. Her courage redefined what it meant to be impossible. She was not trying to prove that a woman could fly. She was proving that a human could dream without limits. Today, when a plane arcs across the sky, its contrail glowing like a silver thread, we are reminded of her. Somewhere out there, in the vast silence of the Pacific, lies the final chapter of her story. But perhaps it is better that it remains unwritten, because in not knowing where she fell, we keep her forever flying. Amelia Earhart's voice was lost to the static of time, but her echo remains. It whispers through the clouds, carried by every pilot who dares to lift off, and by every soul who refuses to stop chasing the horizon. High in the mountains of Rwanda, where the clouds drift low and the jungle hums with rain, a woman lived among giants. They were not the monsters of legend, but the gentle gorillas of the Virunga. For nearly 2 decades, she studied them, protected them, and gave her life for them. Her name was Dian Fossey, and her death remains as mysterious and haunting as the mists that surrounded her. Dian was born in San Francisco in 1932, a shy and solitary child who found peace in the company of animals. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, but took a different path, studying occupational therapy instead. Yet her heart remained wild. In 1963, she used all her savings to travel to Africa, drawn by a lifelong fascination with mountain gorillas. There, in the high forests of Congo, she met the man who would change her life, anthropologist Louis Leakey. He saw in her what he had seen in Jane Goodall and Birute Galdicus, a rare combination of patience, intelligence, and courage. He sent her into the mountains to live among the gorillas, to know them not as specimens, but as ihio. The work was grueling. The Virunga Mountains were cold, wild, and isolated. The gorillas were shy, fleeing at the first scent of a human. But Dian persisted. She studied them quietly from afar, mimicking their gestures, their sounds, their habits. Slowly, they began to accept her. She gave them names: Digit, Uncle Bert, Macho. They were not numbers in a notebook. They were family. Through her eyes, the world saw them for the first time as what they truly were: intelligent, gentle, and heartbreakingly human. But as her love for the gorillas deepened, so did her hatred for their enemies. Poachers stalked the forests, killing gorillas for trophies or selling their infants to zoos. Dian fought back with fury. She destroyed traps, burned poachers' camps, and patrolled the forest with armed guards. She called her campaign active conservation, but others called it obsession. Her confrontations grew violent. Governments, tourists, and even fellow scientists began to distance themselves from her. She did not care. "When you realize the value of all life," she wrote, "you dwell less on what is past and concentrate more on the preservation of the future." Then, in December 1985, that future ended. Her body was found in her cabin at the Karisoki Research Center. She had been struck down by a machete in the middle of the night. There were scenes of struggle, but no robbery, no clear motive. The killers were never found. Some blamed poachers. Others whispered of political enemies or personal grudges. The truth, like the mist that surrounded her camp, remains hidden. Dian Fossey was buried near her beloved gorillas, beside the grave of Digit, her favorite. On her tombstone, her own words are carved. "No one loved gorillas more." Her murder shocked the world, but also awakened it. Her book, Gorillas in the Mist, published shortly before her death, became a rallying cry for conservation. It revealed not just the plight of the gorillas, but the beauty of a bond between species that transcends fear. Today, the mountain gorillas she fought for still live, their numbers slowly growing after decades of near extinction. Her work continues through the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund, led by those she inspired. The mist has not taken everything. Her spirit still lingers in the forests she called home. Dian Fossey's life was a battle between wonder and rage, compassion and isolation. She gave everything to protect creatures who could not speak for themselves. And though her story ended in violence, it was not tragedy that defined her, it was devotion. In the Virunga Mountains, when the mist drifts through the trees and a silverback beats his chest in the distance, perhaps she is still there, watching quietly. The woman who became one of them. The woman who loved too fiercely to ever walk away. On November 22, 1963, America held its breath. In the bright Texas's sun, a motorcade rolled through the streets of Dallas. Crowds lined the sidewalks, waving flags and swelling. At the center of it all was a young president, confident and radiant, waving from the back of a gleaming open-top car. In that moment, the world saw promise. In the next, it heard the sound that shattered it. 3 gunshots, 3 seconds, and a dream died. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was the symbol of a new America, youthful, eloquent, and unafraid. Born in 1917 to one of the most powerful families in the nation, he was raised for greatness, but tempered by pain. He suffered illness his entire life, surviving on willpower and medication, hiding his frailty behind charm and wit. After heroism in World War II, he entered politics and quickly became a rising star. When he won the presidency in 1960, at just 43 years old, he embodied a generation's hope for renewal. "Ask not what your country can do for you," he said. "Ask what you can do for your country." For a moment, it felt as if anything was possible. The years that followed were turbulent. The Cold War loomed like a storm over every horizon. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The struggle for civil rights divided the nation. Yet through it all, Kennedy projected calm and courage. He made mistakes, but he learned from them. He inspired millions not by perfection, but by presence. He was the promise that decency could still lead, that humanity could still govern power. That promise ended at 12:30 p.m. in Dealey Plaza. As the president's car turned past the Texas School Book Depository, the shots rang out. A bullet struck his neck. Another shattered his skull. His wife, Jacqueline, reached for him as the motorcade sped toward Parkland Hospital. 30 minutes later, he was pronounced dead. Outside, the crowd that had cheered moments before stood silent, their flags drooping in disbelief. The television networks interrupted their programs, and the nation began to grieve in real time. It was the first assassination witnessed by an Indus generation. The accused shooter, Lee Harvey Oswald, was captured within hours, but his own death 2 days later, shot on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, turned tragedy into conspiracy. The questions began immediately. Was it really Oswald alone? Was there another gunman? Did the truth die with him? Decades later, the answers remain tangled in secrecy and speculation. The mystery became part of the story, as haunting as the act itself. Kennedy's death was not just a political assassination. It was a wound to the soul of a nation. He represented possibility, the idea that leadership could be noble and vision could be pure. His sudden loss created a void no one could fill. The 60s that followed would be marked by turmoil, protest, and disillusionment. Yet his words, his image, his ideals, those endured. The flame he lit refused to die. At Arlington National Cemetery, an eternal flame burns beside his grave. It flickers against the wind, small but steady, like the hope he once carried. People still come, standing in silence before the words carved in stone. Let the word go forth from this time and place. They come not just to mourn, but to remember what he represented, a moment when the future still felt within reach. History often measures men by what they built, but Kennedy is remembered for what he inspired. He reminded the world that leadership was not about power, but about purpose. And though the shot that ended his life was meant to silence him, it only made his voice echo louder through time. Because some moments do not belong to a single life day, they belong to history itself. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, the world awoke to a nightmare. In a dark tunnel beneath the streets of Paris, a black Mercedes lay crushed against a concrete pillar. Flashbulbs flickered through the wreckage, the same lights that had chased her every day of her life. Inside the car was the most photographed woman in the world, Princess Diana. In that moment, the fairy tale ended, and the legend began. Diana Spencer was only 19 when she married Prince Charles in 1981. The wedding was called the event of the century, a real-life fairy tale, watched by hundreds of millions around the world. But behind the smiles and the gown, she was a young woman, stepping into a cage made of gold and expectation. The palace wanted perfection. The press wanted her soul. And the world wanted her to be both angel and idol. What no one asked was what she wanted. At first she played her role beautifully, graceful, compassionate, radiant. She became the people's princess, adored not just for her beauty, but for her heart. She visited hospitals, hugged AIDS patients when others were afraid to touch them, held hands with lepers, and spoke to the homeless as equals. Wherever she went, the cameras followed. They loved her kindness, but they fed on her pain. Her marriage began to crumble under the weight of betrayal and scrutiny. The whispers of infidelity became headlines, and the girl who had captured the world's heart became its most public victim. When she and Charles divorced in 1996, she was finally free, but never truly safe. Freedom only made the cameras hungrier. Every step she took, every word she said, every thought she met, became a story. The press called it fascination. To her, it was suffocation. Still, she tried to live on her own terms, raising her sons, working for charities, and finding brief moments of peace in a life that had never belonged entirely to her. On that final night in Paris, she was not wearing a crown or attending a gala. She was simply a woman trying to escape the flash of cameras, riding with her companion, Dodi Fayed, through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The driver, chased by paparazzi, lost control. The car struck a pillar at high speed. Within moments, silence replaced chaos. Diana was pulled from the wreckage alive, but gravely injured. At 4:00 a.m., she was pronounced dead at Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. She was 36 years old. The world stopped. In London, Flowers piled outside Kensington Palace by the thousands. Strangers wept openly in the streets. News anchors cried on air. The monarchy, stunned and silent, struggled to understand the scale of the grief. For millions, it was not just the death of a princess, it was the death of innocence. The woman they had watched grow, love, and suffer had become something eternal. In the years since, questions have never stopped. Was it an accident? Was it avoidable? Could she have been saved? Every theory, every retelling, only deepened the mystery. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Diana was killed not by conspiracy, but by obsession. The endless hunger of a world that could not stop watching her even as it drove her to her death. And yet, her story did not end in that tunnel. Her compassion changed the way royalty was seen. Her openness reshaped how the world spoke about pain and vulnerability. Her sons, William and Harry, grew into men, carrying her light forward in their own ways. Through them and through every heart she touched, her legacy lives on. Princess Diana once said, "Only do what your heart tells you." She lived and died by those words. She taught a world obsessed with power that love is strength, that empathy is courage. The cameras took her life, but they could not take her truth. The tunnel where she died is now a shrine. Flowers, candles, photographs, tokens of a love that refuses to fade. In the silence of that place, if you listen closely, you can almost hear her laughter again. Gentle, human, free at last. On a gray December morning in 2006, in a stark room on the outskirts of Baghdad, the reign of one of the 20th century's most feared men came to an end. Surrounded by guards and cameras, Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, stood at the gallows. The man who once ruled with terror and brutality faced the final judgment of the people he had oppressed for decades. A noose waited. History held its breath. Saddam's rise was the story of ambition without mercy. Born in a poor village near Tikrit in 1937, he grew up in violence and learned early that fear could be power. At 20, he joined the Ba'ath Party, a movement promising Arab unity and socialism. But his motives were not idealism. They were domination. By 1979, he had seized control of Iraq, purging rivals with cold precision. On his first day as president, he convened a meeting of party leaders, read out a list of supposed traitors, and ordered their execution as others watched. From that moment on, Iraq belonged to him. For more than 2 decades, Saddam ruled through terror. His secret police silenced dissent. His wars drained nations. His palaces glittered above starving cities. In 1980, he invaded Iran, beginning an 8-year conflict that killed more than 1 million people. Later, he turned his own weapons on the Kurdish people of northern Iraq, using poison gas on villages in a campaign of genocide. In 1990, he invaded Kuwait, provoking a global war that left his military shattered, but his pride intact. He called himself the Lion of Babylon. The world saw a dictator draped in blood and gold. Even after defeat, he held on to power through fear. Statues of his image towered over every city. His face appeared on walls, on money, on the minds of millions. To speak against him was death. To praise him was survival. He believed himself untouchable, protected by destiny and paranoia. But empires built on fear eventually collapse under their own weight. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq, accusing Saddam of harboring weapons of mass destruction. Within weeks, his regime fell. Statues were toppled, ministries burned, and the dictator vanished. For months, he hid in bunkers and farmhouses, a ghost in the ruins of his empire. When American soldiers finally found him in December of that year, he was hiding in a small underground hole near his hometown, disheveled and unrecognizable. The mighty ruler of Iraq was dragged from the earth like a man who had buried himself in his own lies. His trial began in 2005 before an Iraqi court. For the first time, the man who had once commanded armies faced his people as a prisoner. He remained defiant, shouting curses, refusing to acknowledge the court's authority. But his words had lost their power. The victims' families testified, recounting decades of fear, torture, and death. On November 5, 2006, he was found guilty of crimes against humanity and sentenced to hang. On the morning of his execution, Saddam appeared calm, dressed in a dark coat, Quran in hand. He spoke defiantly to his captors. Moments later, the platform beneath him dropped, and the chapter of his rule closed forever. Some cheered. Others watched in unease. Because even in death, Saddam Hussein left behind questions about justice, vengeance, and the price of retribution. Iraq did not find peace after his fall. The power vacuum he left behind plunged the country into years of chaos, war, and sectarian violence. The man who had promised unity had left only division. His palaces turned to ruins, his monuments to dust, and yet his ghost lingered in the pain of those he ruled. Saddam's story is not just the fall of a tyrant, it is the warning of what happens when fear replaces faith, when pride replaces purpose. Power built on cruelty is an empire built on sand. It stands tall until the wind remembers. On that final day, as the noose tightened and the world watched, the man who believed himself eternal became what all tyrants eventually become, a cautionary tale. His kingdom vanished, but the lessons of his fall remain, carved into the memory of a century that learned too late how easily strength turns into ruin. On the night of May 1, 2011, in a quiet compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a team of U.S. Navy SEALs descended from the sky. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, their mission clear: capture or kill the most wanted man in the world. Minutes later, a single shot ended a decade of fear. The man was Osama bin Laden, the face of modern terror, the architect of September 11th. His death closed one chapter of history, but the shadow he cast remains. Bin Laden was born in 1957 in Saudi Arabia, one of more than 50 children of a wealthy construction magnate. His family built mosques and palaces for swings. Al-Mama, calm and soft-spoken, grew up surrounded by privilege, but drawn to faith and ideology. In the 1980s, as the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, he joined the resistance, funding fighters and building networks. To many, he was a hero, then a rich man, who had chosen hardship over comfort. But the seeds of fanaticism were already growing. When the war ended, he turned his attention westward. He saw the presence of American troops in Muslim lands as an insult to faith and sovereignty. In 1988, he founded Al-Qaeda, a loose network of militants united by a single, ruthless vision: to drive the West out of the Middle East through violence and fear. His words spread faster than his face. He became the unseen enemy, moving through deserts and mountains, preaching holy war to those desperate for meaning. On September 11, 2001, his message reached its terrible peak. 19 men hijacked 4 commercial planes. 2 struck the World Trade Center in New York. 1 hit the Pentagon. The last crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in a single morning. The world watched in horror as the Twin Towers collapsed, their smoke darkening the sky. In that instant, bin Laden's name became synonymous with evil. America declared war not on a country, but on a man, and the movement he had unleashed. For 10 years he evaded capture. The United States invaded Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, hunted him through mountains and caves. He released videos from hiding, his eyes calm, his words chilling. He became a symbol, part man, part myth. his very survival a message to his followers that faith could defy the strongest emperor. But time erodes even myths. In 2010, intelligence operatives traced a trusted courier to a walled compound in Abbottabad. The building was strange: no phone lines, no internet, and high walls that kept the world out. For months, surveillance confirmed what many feared and hoped. Bin Laden was inside. On the night of May 1st, President Barack Obama gave the order. Operation Neptune Spear began. The helicopters flew low, their rotors slicing through the dark. When one crashed during landing, the team pressed on. Inside the compound, they found bin Laden on the third floor, unarmed but defiant. A single bullet ended his life. The operation lasted 40 minutes. His body was taken away under the cover of night. He's buried at sea to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. For the families of the victims, it was closure. For the world, it was the end of an era. But the death of one man did not end the war he began. Al-Qaeda splintered, evolved, and inspired new generations of extremists. The fear he created still lingers, not in the form of armies, but in ideas, twisted, persistent, and viral. Bin Laden may have died, but the consequences of his choices ripple through history. Osama bin Laden's story is not one of faith, but of obsession. He mistook vengeance for virtue, conviction for truth. In the pursuit of power disguised as purity, he became the very darkness he claimed to fight. His death was justice, but also a reminder: violence never ends where it begins. It echoes. In the silence that followed the gunfire that night, the world exhaled. The face that haunted a generation was gone. But his legacy serves as both warning and question. How do you defeat an idea born of hate? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the shadow he left, but in the light the world must choose to follow. Across centuries and continents, humanity has always told stories of death. Kings, peasants, warriors, dreamers, all fall, and yet their endings live on. We remember their suffering, their courage, their last breaths, not just to mourn them, but to understand ourselves. Every tragedy is a reflection, a mirror in which we see what it means to be human. This is not a story about death. It is a story about remembrance. From the boiling cauldron of Ishikawa Gumon to the silent flames that claimed Joan of Arc, from the cold stars of Bruno's universe to the roar of revolution that devoured Robespierre, each story we have told in this series is a note in the same song, the song of impermanence. Empires rise, ideals burn, and lives end. Yet something in us insists on keeping their names alive. Why? Perhaps because memory is the closest thing we have to immortality. We remember heroes because they show us what courage looks like when the world turns cruel. We remember villains because they remind us how power can twist the soul. We remember martyrs because they teach us that conviction can outlast flesh. Every death tells a truth that life alone cannot. The Romans said, "Memento mori," remember that you must die. But in remembering death, we also remember meaning. We learn that time erases everything, except the stories we choose to tell. In every age, the face of death changes. In ancient times, it was the sword and the flame. In modern times, it is silence, despair, or a bullet in the dark. But the pattern remains. We build, we fall, we rebuild. History is not a straight line. It is a circle of echoes, each generation haunted by the last. The people we have spoken of, queens, emperors, rebels, scientists, saints, they were not so different from us. They loved, feared, dreamed, and broke in the same ways. They looked at the stars and wondered how long their names would last. And still, against all reason, we remember them. We turn their pain into stories, their ashes into lessons, their endings into beginnings. Because to remember is to resist oblivion. It is to say that even when the body is gone, the truth remains. The father who held his child above boiling water. The woman who faced the fire without fear. The thinker who whispered, and yet it moves. The dreamers who died chasing freedom, light, or love. They are all part of us now. Death, in the end, is not the villain of history. Forgetting is. Every time we tell these stories, every time a voice speaks a name long buried, we defy the silence that waits for us all. That is why we build monuments. That is why we write. That is why we listen to history in the dark, not to escape death, but to understand it. Because death is not the opposite of life. It is its teacher. It reminds us that everything precious must one day end, and that is what gives it meaning. Without that truth, there would be no courage, no compassion, no beauty and defiance. The flame matters because it flickers. The song matters because it stops. We matter because we vanish. So tonight, as the last echo of this story fades, remember those who came before. The rulers and rebels, the saints and sinners, the lost and the forgotten. They are gone, but not silent. They speak through the centuries, through the pages of history, through the heartbeat of those who still care enough to listen. And if you listen closely beyond the fire, beyond the wars, beyond the sorrow, you may hear the quiet truth that connects them all. We tell stories of death not to grieve, but to keep living, to look into the mirror of the past and recognize the face staring back. It is ours.